Mr. Calder, this court isn't a charity,
the judge said, lips curling as her eyes swept his worn shoes. The judge smirked at the SingleDad's wrinkled shirt and shaking hands. She treated him like a nuisance, brushing off his paperwork and hinting his child would be better elsewhere. But he didn't argue or raise his voice, only folded his hands as if bracing for whether he'd survived before. Because what unfolded in that courtroom would force power itself to blink first. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Everyone in the room could feel it. The quiet cruelty dressed up as procedure, the way authority leaned back, certain it had already won. The bench loomed higher than necessary, polished wood gleaming under fluorescent lights, while the man standing alone before it looked smaller by design. His silence wasn't confusing. It was restrained. And beneath the surface, something else was happening, something the court didn't know how to measure yet. He finally spoke when prompted, voice even, steady enough that it cut through the murmurs behind him. Evan Calder gave his name without embellishment, as if names were tools meant only for clarity. He didn't flinch when the judge repeated it with faint amusement, didn't correct the tone, didn't rush. Calm sat on him like armor that didn't shine. That calm wasn't natural to a father about to lose his child. It was learned. He stood there thinking of Lucas's small hand curled around his finger that morning, of the careful way he'd measured medication before school, of the backpack patched twice because it still worked. The court saw a maintenance worker who smelled faintly of cleaning solvent. He felt the weight of a promise made at a graveside, one he'd carried longer than any badge. The judge tapped her pen, the sound sharp and impatient. Papers slid across the bench, dismissed with a glance. Income, hours, availability. Each word landed like a verdict already written. Around them, the courtroom breathed. Chairs creaked, a baby fussed somewhere in the gallery. The HVAC rattled like it always did. He noticed everything. He always did. When asked about his work schedule, he answered plainly. Nights. Overtime when offered. No excuses. When pressed about childcare contingencies, he outlined them cleanly, sequentially. The way you would brief a plan meant to hold under pressure. The judge frowned, unimpressed, mistaking precision for rehearsed deception. Her smirk returned when she referenced his job title. Maintenance. The word hung there, heavy with implication. She suggested instability without saying it outright, letting the room draw its own conclusions. A few heads nodded. Others looked away. He felt the familiar heat of judgment but kept his posture neutral, shoulders squared, chin level. Inside, his thoughts stayed with Lucas. The boy's laugh when the bus door hissed open. The way he counted steps to calm himself. This hearing wasn't about dignity or reputation. It was about keeping that laugh close enough to hear at night. Losing meant more than paperwork. It meant silence where a voice should be. The judge leaned forward, eyes sharp now, and questioned his understanding of systems. Her tone implied that some people simply weren't built to navigate them, and he almost smiled at that. Almost. Instead, he acknowledged the question and answered only what was asked, no more. The courtroom clock ticked loudly, each second stretching. In the gallery, a tall, older man shifted in his seat. Gray hair, straight back, eyes fixed on the exchange. He noticed the way the fathers stood, the economy of movement, the absence of fidgeting. Recognition stirred, faint but persistent. He said nothing. Not yet. The judge sighed theatrically and began summarizing the risks, her words stacking neatly toward a conclusion she seemed eager to reach. Temporary placement. Further review. The kind of phrases that sounded reasonable until you imagined a child sleeping in a strange bed. The father's jaw tightened once, then settled. When the clerk asked for additional documents, he reached into his folder and handed them over without comment. The folder was old, corners soft, a thin laminated card tucked inside like a bookmark. No one noticed it. No one thought it mattered. As the papers were reviewed, the judge's impatience grew. She glanced at the clock, at the line of cases waiting, and back at the man who refused to crumble. Her smirk faded into irritation. Control mattered to her. Compliance mattered more. He waited. He had waited in worse rooms than this, under harsher lights, with far more on the line. This was just another threshold. And somewhere beneath the polished wood and practiced authority, the balance was already shifting, unnoticed, inevitable, like pressure building before a breach. The clerk's fingers paused over the paperwork, eyes narrowing as she scanned a line twice. The room held its breath for a fraction of a second before the judge cleared her throat, sharp and deliberate, reclaiming momentum. She waved a hand as if the hesitation meant nothing and leaned back, chair creaking beneath her authority. "So, you work nights?" the judge said, voice smooth again, almost bored. "Which means your child spends a significant amount of time without you. That's concerning." He felt the word land. Concerning, not dangerous, not neglectful, just enough to stain. He answered evenly, explaining routines, neighbors, backups. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't rush. The explanation came out structured, each point placed carefully, like he was building something meant to stand. The judge listened with half her attention, pen tapping again, already deciding what mattered. She interrupted him mid-sentence. "Aka, that's enough. I've heard what I need." The interruption wasn't loud, but it was surgical, cutting off not just his words but the right to finish them. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Someone exhaled sharply. The tall, older man's jaw tightened. The judge pivoted to the clerk, asking about financial disclosures, emphasizing limited means as if it were a moral flaw. The clerk hesitated again, this time longer. There was something off in the records, something that didn't line up cleanly. Before she could speak, the judge pressed on, her impatience flaring. "We can address discrepancies later. Right now, the child's best interest is stability." Stability. He almost laughed at that. Not out of humor, but recognition. Stability wasn't a concept to him, it was a checklist. A set of conditions you maintained no matter what. He thought of the apartment kept meticulously clean, the fridge labeled, the calendar color-coded. He thought of how many times he'd gone without sleep to make sure mornings felt normal. When the judge suggested a temporary placement review, the word temporary echoed louder than anything else. He felt it in his chest, a dull pressure, but his face stayed composed. Losing control here wouldn't help Lucas. He reminded himself of that, the way he always did. Emotion acknowledged, then contained. The tall man in the gallery leaned forward slightly now, forearms on knees, eyes never leaving the father. There was a familiarity in the posture, in the way the man absorbed the room. He'd seen it before, years ago, in places where decisions carried immediate consequences. He glanced down at the folder in the father's hands, noticed how it was held. Not clutched, just ready. The judge asked another question, this one sharper, probing his understanding of court procedures and follow-ups. It sounded less like curiosity and more like a trap. He answered precisely, referencing steps, timelines, documentation requirements. The judge frowned, thrown off just a little. That wasn't the response she expected from someone she'd already categorized. She masked it quickly, returning to her earlier tone. "Even so, you have to understand that this court sees many parents who believe effort alone compensates for limited resources. That's not how reality works." The words stung because they were designed to. He shifted his weight subtly, grounding himself, eyes steady on the bench. "I understand how systems work," he said calmly. No challenge, no apology. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge's pen stopped tapping. For a brief moment, something like annoyance flickered across her face. She didn't like being contradicted, especially not by someone she hadn't granted permission to speak beyond her questions. The clerk cleared her throat softly. "Your Honor, there's a notation here." "We'll get to it," the judge snapped, cutting her off this time. The clerk flushed and fell silent. The tall man's eyes narrowed further. Cutting off your own staff was never a good sign. It meant pressure was building. The judge adjusted her robe and glanced at the clock again. "Given the information presented, I'm inclined to—" She paused, perhaps sensing the room's attention sharpening. Authority worked best when no one questioned it. Too many eyes were questioning now. He felt the shift, subtle but real. This was the moment where things could slide quietly into loss. Paperwork sealing fate without drama. He inhaled slowly, then spoke when allowed, asking for clarification on the review process. The question was simple, procedural, but it forced the judge to articulate steps she'd hoped to fast-track. As she explained, her words grew more careful. Details mattered when spoken aloud. Witnesses remembered them. He listened closely, nodding once, filing everything away. The tall man in the gallery straightened, recognition deepening into certainty. "If you're still with this story, make sure you're subscribed. Because what's about to surface in this courtroom changes everything." And the judge finished her explanation and looked down at him, expression guarded now. The smirk was gone, replaced by something harder to read. He met her gaze without flinching. The balance hadn't tipped yet, but it was no longer settled. And somewhere between the clerk's quiet notes and the gallery's held breath, the first crack in the court's certainty widened, just enough for the truth to start pushing through. The judge's explanation settled into the room like dust, visible and irritating, coating everything it touched. She spoke of reviews and contingencies, of evaluations that sounded neutral, until you imagined a child waiting for permission to stay home. When she finished, the clerk nodded, the gallery murmured, and the father felt the weight of what came next pressing against his ribs. He asked one more question, quiet but pointed, about medical considerations. The word medical shifted the air. A few heads turned. The judge's brows lifted, surprised, then flattened again as if annoyed by the detour. She gestured for him to continue, already preparing to swat the concern aside. He explained without embellishment. His son's condition wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Routine medication, predictable triggers, the kind of thing that required consistency more than money. He outlined schedules, symptoms, contingencies, the way nights were structured so mornings didn't unravel. The explanation wasn't emotional, it was precise. The judge listened, tapping her pen slower now. "And you believe you're the only one who can manage this?" she asked, voice edged with skepticism. It was framed as a question, but it carried an accusation. He shook his head once. "No, I believe I'm the one who already does." The answer was simple, unguarded. A few people in the gallery nodded before they realized they were doing it. The judge pursed her lips. She flipped a page, scanning numbers again, then glanced at the clerk. "Are there any verified medical notes in the file?" The clerk hesitated, eyes flicking to the father's folder. "There are summaries," she said carefully, "and a continuity plan." The judge waved it off. Summaries aren't guarantees. Her gaze returned to the man standing before her. "You understand that courts prioritize redundancy. Systems fail when they rely on a single point." He understood that better than she knew. He thought of nights when redundancy meant backup generators, overlapping teams, fail-safes layered until nothing could slip through. He didn't say that. He said, "That's why I built one." The judge blinked. "You built what?" "A plan," he said, "for when I'm not there." He listed names, neighbors, a school nurse, a route to the nearest clinic. Each item landed with quiet certainty. The room grew still. Even the HVAC seemed to pause between rattles. The tall man in the gallery leaned back slightly, arms crossed now, studying the exchange with the soldier's patience. He noticed the structure in the explanation, the absence of wasted words. This wasn't a parent scrambling. This was someone briefing a scenario. The judge cleared her throat. "Planning is commendable," she said, tone shifting again. "But intent doesn't equal capacity." She emphasized the last word, glancing pointedly at the father's job title printed on the file. The implication burned. Capacity. He felt it in his shoulders, and the urge to correct, to explain. He let it pass. Control mattered more than satisfaction. He nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. A woman in the gallery whispered something to the person beside her. The clerk adjusted her glasses and looked back down at the file, frowning. There was that notation again, the one that didn't fit neatly into the judge's narrative. The judge moved on, summarizing risks with practiced efficiency. Temporary separation framed as caution, evaluation framed as opportunity. Each phrase softened the blow while sharpening the blade. The father listened, jaw tight but steady, hands resting loosely at his sides. His thoughts drifted, unbidden, to Lucas's room. The nightlight shaped like a rocket. The chart on the wall where stars marked good days. He pictured explaining this to a child who measured safety and routine. The idea of disruption made his chest ache. When the judge finished, she paused, eyes sweeping the room as if checking for dissent. "Given these factors," she began, then stopped. The clerk had raised her hand slightly, tentative but insistent. "Yes?" the judge snapped. "There's a discrepancy in the employment verification," the clerk said. "The hours match, but the classification code is unusual." The judge sighed, irritation flashing. "We're not here to audit payroll." She turned back to the father. "Unless you have something new to add, we'll proceed." He did have something. He could feel it pressing against his tongue. Not a revelation, not yet, but a correction. He chose his words carefully. "I'd like the discrepancy noted," he said. "For accuracy." The request was modest, almost boring. That was what made it effective. Accuracy mattered in court. The judge hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Noted," she said, though her tone suggested annoyance at being slowed. The tall man in the gallery exhaled slowly, a thin smile touching his mouth. The crack had widened. Small, almost invisible, but real. The father returned his focus to the bench, posture unchanged. The room felt different now, charged with questions no one had planned to ask. The judge sensed it too, shifting in her seat, adjusting her robe as if to reclaim certainty. But certainty was already leaking out, pooling quietly at her feet, waiting for the moment when standing would no longer be optional. The judge shifted in her chair, the faint squeak echoing louder than it should have. She didn't like the way the room had slowed down, how small procedural questions were beginning to demand attention. Control depended on momentum, and momentum was slipping through her fingers. She leaned forward again, voice firm, reclaiming the cadence of authority. "Mr. Calder, courts don't operate on hypotheticals and intentions. We operate on verified capacity." Her gaze flicked briefly to the clerk, then back to him, sharpened. "And capacity is demonstrated through consistency, resources, and compliance. The words were clean, polished, and dismissive all at once. Around them, the gallery absorbed the message. This was a system speaking to someone it had already decided didn't belong at the center of it. He stood still, shoulders squared, breathing steady. The urge to correct her definition of capacity pulsed behind his eyes. He knew exactly what it took to keep something running under pressure, to anticipate failure before it happened. He swallowed the impulse. This wasn't the moment. The judge continued, now fully back in her rhythm. She referenced prior cases, generalized outcomes, statistical risks. Each example subtly painted him as interchangeable, another file in a long line of inadequate parents. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. The smirk returned, thinner now, edged with impatience rather than amusement. A chair creaked in the gallery as someone shifted uncomfortably. The tall, older man remained still, hands folded, eyes locked on the bench. He watched the way the judge talked past the father rather than to him, watched the way she reduced a life into bullet points. The clerk typed quietly, fingers hesitating more often now. She glanced up once, meeting the father's eyes for half a second before looking away. There was uncertainty there. Doubt. The judge pivoted back to finances, pressing harder. Limited income increases vulnerability, she said. Emergencies don't wait for good intentions. She paused, then added, almost casually, and you don't appear to have the professional background that allows for flexibility. That landed harder than the rest. Professional background. He felt his jaw tighten, then release. The word background carried weight. Assumptions layered into it like sediment. She had no idea how wrong she was. He answered carefully. My schedule is flexible when it needs to be. It was true, though not in the way she imagined. The judge scoffed softly, the sound unmistakable. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. She raised a hand before he could continue. We'll determine that, she said, tone clipped. Right now, what I see is a parent stretched thin, relying on personal discipline rather than institutional support. Personal discipline. The phrase almost drew a breath of laughter from him, but he held it back. Discipline was the one thing no one had ever questioned about him until now. The judge straightened, clearly preparing to steer the hearing toward a conclusion. Given the information presented, she began again, the court must consider whether temporary placement— The clerk cleared her throat, louder this time. Your Honor, she said, voice steadier, there's also a notation attached to the continuity plan. It references external oversight. The judge's head snapped toward her. We've covered this, she said sharply. Oversight is irrelevant unless it's current. It appears to be, the clerk replied, choosing her words with care. There's a review code, but it's not one I recognize. Silence fell. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that made people lean forward. The judge frowned, irritation flickering into something closer to concern. She didn't like unfamiliar codes. Unfamiliar meant unpredictable. She turned back to the father, eyes narrowing. Would you care to explain? The question was loaded now, no longer dismissive but probing. He met her gaze. This was closer to the line. He chose his words slowly. It's part of my record, he said. It's accurate. That's not an explanation, she snapped. No, he agreed calmly. It's a clarification. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The tall man shifted at last, crossing one leg over the other, attention sharpening. The judge bristled at the quiet challenge embedded in the exchange. She didn't like being corrected, especially not in front of an audience. Her smirk vanished completely now, replaced by tight control. "This court doesn't run on implications," she said. "If there's something relevant, it should have been disclosed." "It was," he replied. "It's in the file." The clerk looked down again, scrolling, eyes widening slightly. The judge noticed. Her fingers tightened around her pen. For the first time, the authority on the bench looked unsure, not lost, but irritated by the fact that certainty was no longer effortless. She adjusted her robe, posture stiffening, as if physical composure could restore narrative dominance. The father stood exactly as he had since the beginning, unchanged. The room felt smaller now, a pressure building in the space between bench and floor. Everyone could sense it. The hearing had crossed a threshold. And in the gallery, the tall older man leaned forward, recognition settling into resolve. He knew that look on the judge's face. He'd seen it before, right before someone realized they'd underestimated the wrong person. The silence stretched longer than protocol allowed, and everyone felt it. The judge broke eye contact first, turning sharply to the clerk. "Pull up the notation," she ordered. Her voice had lost its earlier ease, replaced by something clipped and defensive. The clerk nodded and began typing, the keyboard clicks suddenly loud in the stillness. He remained where he was, hands relaxed at his sides. This was the point where people usually filled the air, apologies, explanations, excuses. He didn't. He watched the judge instead, noting the way her shoulders had stiffened, the way control now required effort. The clerk frowned at the screen. "It's attached to a sealed reference," she said carefully. "The code routes through a federal verification channel." She hesitated, then added, "That's not typical for family court filings." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Federal meant wait. Federal meant this wasn't just a clerical curiosity. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't like surprises, especially ones that implied oversight beyond her bench. She turned back to him, eyes sharp. "You're saying this court overlooked federally linked documentation?" "I'm saying it was included," he replied evenly. "And it's relevant." The word relevant hung there, challenging. The judge glanced at the screen again, but then at the clerk. "Why wasn't this flagged earlier?" she demanded. The clerk swallowed. "It's embedded, Your Honor. It wouldn't trigger unless someone knew what to look for." The judge's gaze snapped back to him. "And you knew?" He nodded once. "Yes." That single syllable landed harder than any speech could have. The room shifted again, chairs creaking, bodies leaning forward. The tall older man in the gallery exhaled slowly, recognition sharpening into certainty now. The judge straightened, bristling. "If you possess specialized knowledge that affects this case, you were obligated to disclose it plainly." "I did," he said, "in writing." Her fingers tightened around the pen until her knuckles paled. She didn't like being cornered by procedure. She preferred narratives she could control. This one was slipping, and the clerk cleared her throat again. "Your Honor, the seal can be opened with authorization." She hesitated, then added, "But it will be logged." Logged meant traceable. Logged meant accountability. The judge hesitated, eyes flicking briefly to the gallery, to the number of witnesses now fully engaged. Whatever she chose next would be remembered. Before she could answer, the tall man in the gallery stood halfway, then paused, as if checking himself. The movement alone drew every eye. He sat back down, but the message had landed. Someone here knew more. The judge noticed him now, truly noticed him, and something in her expression shifted from irritation to calculation. She turned back to the clerk. "Open it," she said sharply. "We'll address whatever's there." The clerk's fingers moved again, faster now. He felt his pulse steady, the familiar sensation of a plan unfolding exactly when it needed to. He thought briefly of Lucas, of the boy's morning smile, and let that ground him. As the file loaded, the judge filled the space with commentary, emphasizing caution, process, and responsibility. It sounded rehearsed, like she was reminding herself as much as the room. The clerk stopped typing. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "it's confirming prior service credentials and oversight history. It's extensive." The judge's head snapped up. "Service?" she repeated, the word edged with disbelief. He didn't move, didn't speak. He let the record do what it was meant to do. The clerk continued, voice careful. "The code links to an external review authority. It verifies leadership classification, operational clearance, and long-term evaluation for dependents." Dependents. When the judge's eyes flicked to him again, then away. This wasn't fitting into her earlier assumptions. She adjusted her robe, buying time. "That doesn't automatically translate to parental fitness," she said, but the confidence was gone. "No," he agreed calmly. "It translates to capacity." The word echoed back at her, inverted, capacity. The judge swallowed, irritation now tangled with something closer to unease. She looked down at the screen again, reading more carefully this time. The gallery was silent now, fully alert. The tall man finally stood all the way up, posture straight, presence undeniable. He didn't speak yet, but he didn't need to. His stance alone signaled that the story the court thought it was telling was no longer intact. If you're following this moment, make sure you're subscribed, because what's about to come out doesn't just change this case, it changes how everyone in that room sees him. The judge looked up again, meeting the father's eyes. For the first time, there was no smirk, only calculation and the dawning realization that she had underestimated the reach of the man standing quietly before her. The judge stared at the screen longer than necessary, as if more time might make the information rearrange itself into something familiar. It didn't. The lines stayed exactly where they were, dense with terminology she rarely encountered and authority she didn't command. She leaned back slowly, the movement careful, controlled, like someone recalibrating after misjudging the depth of the water. The tall man in the gallery remained standing now. Not rigid, not aggressive, just present. His posture alone carried weight, the kind earned rather than granted. The judge noticed the small details then, the way he waited to be acknowledged, the absence of impatience. Experience recognized experience. "Sir," the judge said sharply, redirecting, "if you intend to involve yourself in this proceeding, identify yourself." The man inclined his head slightly. "Samuel Reed," he said evenly, "retired Army Sergeant Major." He paused, then added, "I served with the father for years." A collective intake of breath moved through the gallery. The words didn't explode. They landed, solid and undeniable. The judge's expression tightened, then smoothed, the practiced mask slipping back into place with effort. "This is a family court," she said coolly. "Military service, while commendable, does not supersede civilian evaluation." "No, Your Honor," Samuel replied calmly, "but it does contextualize it." The judge's fingers drummed once on the bench before she stopped herself. Context. That was what she'd been denying from the start. She turned back to the father, eyes sharper now, searching for cracks that weren't there. "You chose not to disclose this in open court," she said. "I disclosed it in the file," he answered. Open court disclosure wasn't required. Samuel nodded once, subtle affirmation. The clerk glanced between them, then back to the screen, scrolling further. Her eyes widened again. "Your Honor," she said softly, "there are commendations attached, leadership evaluations, and recommendations regarding dependents under extraordinary circumstances." Extraordinary circumstances. The phrase carried its own gravity. The judge's jaw tightened. She didn't like that this information existed without her prior command of it. She leaned forward again, reclaiming her posture. "Let's be clear," she said. "This court assesses parenting, not tactical competence." Samuel took a step forward, stopping well short of the bench. "With respect," he said, "this court questioned his capacity, his discipline, his ability to manage under pressure. I'm here to tell you that managing under pressure is exactly what he was trained to do." The judge opened her mouth, then closed it. The gallery was utterly silent now, the kind of silence that forced every word to matter. She glanced at the father again, really looked at him. The calm hadn't wavered. The restraint hadn't cracked. What she'd mistaken for submission was something else entirely. "And your child?" she asked him suddenly. "Was this background active during the child's upbringing?" "No," he said. "I left a service when my wife died." The words were simple, unadorned. They didn't need decoration. "My son was the mission after that." Something shifted then. Not dramatically, quietly. The judge's shoulders dropped a fraction, the tension redistributing. She looked away for a moment as if recalibrating not just the case, but her own certainty. The clerk scrolled further. "There's also a continuity certification," she said. "It appears to be reviewed annually." Annually. The judge's eyes snapped back. "By whom?" The clerk hesitated. "By an external oversight board, federal." The judge exhaled slowly, nostrils flaring. Federal oversight meant scrutiny beyond her bench, beyond her assumptions. And this wasn't a narrative she could tidy up with a ruling and move on from. She looked at Samuel again. "Why stand now?" she asked. "Why not earlier?" Samuel met her gaze without flinching. "Because he didn't ask me to," he said, "and because dignity matters. But when the court began mistaking silence for incompetence, it was time." The words landed cleanly, without accusation, which somehow made them sharper. A ripple moved through the gallery. Approval, recognition, discomfort. The judge felt it. She straightened again, but the authority felt heavier now, less effortless. She turned back to the father. "Why didn't you correct my assumptions?" she asked, almost genuinely. He considered the question, then answered. "Because assumptions aren't corrected by arguing, they're corrected by facts." He paused. "And by results." The judge held his gaze. For the first time, there was no hierarchy in the exchange, just two people measuring consequence. She nodded once, slowly. "All right," she said. "This court will recess briefly to review the newly surfaced documentation in full." She glanced at the clerk. "Ensure everything is logged." "Yes, Your Honor," the clerk replied quickly. As the judge rose, the gallery finally exhaled, whispers breaking the silence. Samuel sat back down, mission accomplished for now. The father remained standing until directed otherwise, posture unchanged. As the bench emptied, he felt something unfamiliar stir beneath the calm. Not triumph, not yet, but inevitability. The truth was no longer contained. It had stepped into the room, and it wasn't leaving quietly. The judge's chair sat empty now, and the bench suddenly just polished wood without a voice behind it. The clerk gathered files with careful precision, stacking them as if the order might steady the room. A bailiff announced the recess, his tone neutral, but the word carried weight. Recess meant reconsideration. It meant the story had paused, not ended. He remained standing until the bailiff nodded for him to sit. When he did, the wooden chair felt harder than before, pressing into his back. Across the aisle, Samuel settled into his seat again, hands folded, gaze forward. They didn't look at each other. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been communicated. The gallery buzzed quietly now, whispers breaking through restraint. People leaned toward one another, exchanging glances heavy with recalibration. The man who'd been silently judged moments earlier was being reimagined in real time. He could feel it, the shift in attention, the weight of eyes no longer dismissive but curious, respectful, unsettled. The clerk approached his table, voice low. "We'll need a few minutes," she said. Her earlier detachment was gone, replaced by professional caution. She wasn't apologizing, but she wasn't dismissive either. It was a start. He nodded once. Understood. As she stepped away, he exhaled slowly, letting tension drain from his shoulders in measured increments. This was always the dangerous moment, the pause after escalation, where outcomes were decided off stage. He thought of Lucas again. Imagined him tracing the edge of the kitchen table with his fingers, waiting for the afternoon routine to make sense. That thought anchored him. Samuel shifted beside him, leaning slightly closer without breaking posture. "You did right," he murmured, barely audible. It wasn't reassurance, it was confirmation. He inclined his head in acknowledgement, eyes forward. Had to? They sat like that, two men sharing silence built from long familiarity with waiting. Around them, the gallery continued its low murmur. Someone coughed. A child whined, then was hushed. The courthouse noises resumed their ordinary rhythm, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. Behind the bench, a side door opened briefly. The judge emerged with a stack of files, speaking quietly to another official, her expression unreadable. She disappeared again, the door closing softly. The sound felt final, like a seal. Time stretched. The clerk typed steadily at her desk, occasionally glancing up at him, and then back at the screen. Each glance carried more gravity than the last. She was seeing the file differently now, reading it with context instead of assumption. A woman across the aisle caught his eye and offered a small hesitant smile. He returned it politely, then looked away. Sympathy wasn't what he needed. Accuracy was. Samuel shifted again, crossing his arms. "She'll fight to keep control," he said quietly, "but she can't ignore that trail." "I know," he replied. "That's why it's there." Minutes passed. The bailiff checked his watch. The gallery settled into expectant quiet. When the side door opened again, the judge returned alone, posture composed but heavier, as if the robe carried more than fabric now. "All rise," the bailiff called. He stood with the rest of the room, spine straight, breath steady. The judge took her seat. He arranged her papers carefully and looked out over the courtroom. Her eyes swept the gallery, lingering briefly on Samuel before returning to him. "Be seated," she said. As everyone sat, she adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. The sound lacked its earlier impatience. It was measured now, deliberate. "During the recess," she began, "the court reviewed additional documentation associated with this case." The room stilled completely. She continued, choosing each word with care. "It is evident that certain materials were not given appropriate weight during the initial assessment." Her gaze flicked to the clerk, then back to him. "That oversight is being corrected." The admission landed quietly but powerfully. Courts didn't like admitting oversight. He felt a subtle shift inside his chest, not relief, not yet, but confirmation that the process had finally engaged. She outlined procedural adjustments, steps for reevaluation, safeguards to ensure the child's needs were addressed without unnecessary disruption. The language was formal, but the tone was different now, less dismissive, more cautious. As she spoke, he noticed the way she avoided absolute statements, how often she referenced verification and balance. Authority had recalibrated itself around the facts it could no longer deny. When she paused, she looked directly at him. "The court acknowledges the continuity measures you've implemented," she said, "and the external oversight referenced in your file." External oversight. The phrase echoed again, but this time without skepticism. The gallery leaned in, absorbing the shift. She wasn't finished. He could tell this wasn't resolution yet. This was groundwork. "We will proceed carefully," she concluded, "with the child's best interest as the sole priority." He nodded once, acknowledging the statement without celebrating it. Words were promises here. Promises had to be tested. As the judge turned to the next procedural step, Samuel exhaled slowly beside him. The first wall had fallen. Others remained. He sat back, hands resting loosely on his knees, calm and tact. The room felt different now, not friendly, not hostile, but alert. The system was awake, and once awake it would have to see this through. The judge's words settled like wet cement, heavy but still malleable. The courtroom hadn't exhaled yet. Everyone seemed to understand that this phase, careful, procedural, restrained, was where outcomes quietly solidified. Nothing dramatic would happen now, but everything important would. She turned to the clerk, issuing instructions with a tone stripped of earlier impatience. Verification timelines, cross-checks, external correspondence. Each directive acknowledged, typed, logged. The process she trusted most, paperwork, was now the thing binding her to the truth she'd resisted. He listened without comment, tracking each step the way he always did, sequence, dependencies, risks. The structure made sense. That mattered. Emotional validation could wait, stability couldn't. Samuel leaned back slightly, arms uncrossing for the first time. "This is the long part," he murmured under his breath. He nodded. "That's fine." The judge addressed him again, more formally now. "Until this review is complete, the court will maintain current custody arrangements." She paused, then added, "With additional documentation requested." The word maintain landed like oxygen. Not relief, oxygen. Something essential restored so the rest could function. He felt the tension in his spine ease a fraction. The gallery reacted too, though more subtly. A few shoulders dropped. Someone whispered, "Good." The woman who'd smiled earlier pressed her lips together, eyes bright. The narrative had shifted enough for people to hope. The judge wasn't done. She leaned forward again, eyes narrowing with focus rather than judgment. "Mr. Calder, given the complexity of the oversight involved, the court expects full cooperation, timely responses, transparency." He met her gaze. "You'll have it." The simplicity of the answer seemed to throw her off for half a beat. Then she nodded once, brisk. "Good." She moved on to scheduling follow-ups, outlining dates and contingencies. Each step tightened the framework around the case, making it harder for assumptions to slip back in. The clerk kept pace, fingers flying, confidence growing with each confirmed entry. As the judge spoke, he noticed the laminated card still tucked inside his folder, barely visible. It had done its job without being named. Sometimes systems worked best when they weren't explained, only respected. Samuel shifted again, glancing at the gallery. "You feel that?" he asked quietly. "Yes," he replied. "They're watching differently." The judge concluded the procedural rundown and glanced at the bailiff. "We'll adjourn for today." She hesitated, then added, All parties will receive written notice. The gavel struck once. Clean. Final. As people stood, the room filled with motion, chairs scraping, papers rustling, conversations blooming all at once. The intensity broke, but the undercurrent remained. He gathered his folder slowly, methodically, resisting the urge to rush. Rushing made people nervous. Calm made them listen. The clerk approached him again, this time with a different posture. "You'll be contacted directly," she said. "If anything's missing, we'll clarify." "Thank you," he said. The words weren't a concession, they were acknowledgement. Samuel stood beside him, towering slightly, presence unmistakable. A few people in the gallery glanced their way, curiosity unguarded now. One man nodded respectfully. Another offered a quiet, "Good luck." He accepted neither praise nor pity, only facts. As they moved toward the aisle, the judge rose from the bench, robe shifting. She paused, watching him go. For a moment, and it seemed like she might say something more. An explanation, perhaps, or even an apology. She didn't. Authority rarely apologized. It adapted. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt brighter, louder. Footsteps echoed against tile. He paused near a window, letting the noise pass through him. This wasn't over, but it was pointed in the right direction. Samuel stopped beside him. "You okay?" "Yes," he said after a moment. "For now." "That's all you ever aim for," Samuel said, a hint of a smile touching his mouth. He glanced at him briefly, then back out the window. "It's all that's required. If you want to see how preparation beats prejudice every time, make sure you're subscribed, because the final steps of this case prove why quiet groundwork matters more than loud arguments." Down the hall, a child laughed, the sound echoing unexpectedly. It cut through everything else, sharp and clear. He closed his eyes for a second, letting it steady him. That sound was the reason for every choice he'd made, every silence he'd kept. He turned back toward the exit, folder tucked securely under his arm. The system had shifted, but it would test him again. He was ready for that, he always was. And somewhere behind him, inside the courtroom, the paperwork kept moving, slow, inevitable, and finally aligned with the truth. The hallway thinned as people peeled away, conversations dissolving into echoes that bounced off marble and glass. He walked at an unhurried pace, matching the rhythm of his breathing to his steps. Adrenaline still lingered beneath the calm, but it was contained now, folded neatly where it couldn't interfere. Samuel walked beside him until the corridor split, then stopped. "This part's on you," he said quietly. "The system's awake. That's good, but it'll push back." "I expect it," he replied. "It always does." Samuel studied him for a moment, eyes sharp but approving. "Call if you need me." He nodded once. "I will." They parted without ceremony. No handshake, no lingering words. Some bonds didn't require punctuation. He stepped outside into the late afternoon air, the courthouse doors swinging shut behind him with a hollow thud. The city moved on immediately. Traffic humming, a bus sighing at the curb, a vendor calling out to no one in particular. The world hadn't paused for his hearing, and he didn't expect it to. He preferred it this way. Normality was a kind of shelter. He checked his phone. No missed calls. That mattered. Lucas would still be at school, still following the schedule he'd memorized down to the minute. He pictured the boy lining up with his classmates, backpack bouncing slightly with each step, counting under his breath the way he always did. The image steadied him. As he walked toward the bus stop, his mind shifted into preparation mode. The judge's recalibration wasn't a victory, it was an opening. Systems didn't change direction easily, and when they did, they demanded proof at every step. He mentally listed what would be requested next: updated medical letters, school statements, oversight confirmations. He already had most of it. The rest could be obtained. The bus arrived with a hiss of hydraulics. He boarded, tapping his pass, and took a seat near the window. The interior smelled faintly of rubber and cleaning solution, familiar and grounding. As the bus pulled away, the courthouse receded into the distance, its columns shrinking until they were just another shape among many. A woman across the aisle glanced at him, then looked away quickly. Recognition lingered in her expression, not of him specifically, but of something she'd witnessed. He didn't meet her eyes again. Being seen wasn't the goal. Being accurate was. His phone vibrated once. A message from the school. Reminder about pickup time, medication note attached. He opened it, read it carefully, and replied with a brief acknowledgement. Routine reasserted itself, wrapping around him like a well-worn jacket. At the next stop, a man got on carrying a stack of folders, nearly dropping them as the bus lurched. Instinct kicked in. He stood, steadying the stack with one hand, guiding the man into a seat. "Got it," he said quietly. "Thanks," the man replied, breathless. "Long day." He nodded, returning to his seat. Long days were relative. As the bus moved again, his thoughts returned briefly to the judge. Not in anger, not even frustration, but assessment. She hadn't apologized, but she'd adapted. That mattered. Adaptation was the first step toward correction. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. He got off near the school and walked the remaining blocks, the sound of children's voices growing louder with each step. The fence came into view, painted bright but chipped in places, just like every public school fence he'd ever seen. Parents clustered near the gate, some chatting, others checking phones. He spotted Lucas immediately. The boy stood slightly apart from the group, rocking gently on his heels, eyes scanning faces with methodical focus. When he saw him, his face lit up, relief and joy breaking through in equal measure. "Hey," he said, crouching as Lucas ran over. The boy collided with him gently, arms wrapping tight. "Did you win?" Lucas asked, voice earnest, too loud. He smiled softly. "Not yet, but we're still together." That was enough. Lucas nodded, satisfied, and launched into a detailed account of his day. Math problems, a substitute teacher, a classmate who'd forgotten lunch. He listened closely, responding when needed, storing away details like he always did. They walked home together, the late sun casting long shadows ahead of them. As they passed the corner store, Lucas tugged his sleeve. "Can we get apples?" he asked. "The red ones." "Yes," he said without hesitation. Inside the store, he selected the apples carefully, checking for bruises, weighing them in his hand. At the register, the clerk rang them up and glanced at Lucas. "Good day?" she asked. Lucas nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah." He paid and thanked her, then guided Lucas back outside. The ordinary exchange felt almost sacred after the morning's tension. This was what he was protecting. This simplicity, this continuity. As they reached their building, his phone buzzed again. An email notification this time. From the court. Subject line, request for documentation. He didn't open it yet. He already knew what it would say. He unlocked the door, ushered Lucas inside, and set the apples on the counter. Routine resumed. Hand washing, snack prep, medication check. Each step reinforced the truth the court was only beginning to grasp. Later, when Lucas settled at the table with his homework, he finally opened the email, and the language was formal, precise, and thorough. It asked for exactly what he expected. He closed the phone and allowed himself one small, controlled breath of satisfaction. Preparation had met prejudice, and preparation had held. This wasn't over. But it was moving forward, and this time the system was following his lead. The apartment settled into its evening rhythm, the kind built from repetition rather than effort. The hum of the refrigerator, the muted sounds of traffic outside, the scrape of a pencil against paper as Lucas worked through his homework. He moved through it all with practiced ease, guiding without hovering, correcting without pressure. This was the environment he'd built. Predictable, quiet, safe. When Lucas finished, he checked the answers together, marking a small star in the corner of the page. The boy beamed. "Did I do it right?" "You did," he said, "every step." That mattered more than the result. He knew that. He also knew the court would eventually see it, even if it took longer than it should. After dinner, once Lucas was settled with a book on the couch, he returned to the email from the court. He read it slowly this time, line by line, not for content. He'd already anticipated that, but for tone. It was careful, neutral, precise. The earlier assumptions were gone, replaced by methodical distance. That was progress. He opened his laptop and began assembling the requested documents. Medical letters, already scanned and labeled. School statements, filed and updated. Oversight confirmations routed through secure channels. Access points he hadn't used in years, but still remembered instinctively. His fingers moved efficiently, a muscle memory guiding them as much as thought. As he worked, his mind replayed the judge's expression during the recess. Less certainty, more calculation. She hadn't transformed, she'd adjusted. That was enough. Systems didn't need remorse to function properly. They needed friction and facts. Lucas padded over quietly, book tucked under his arm. "What are you doing?" "Paperwork," he said. "Boring stuff." Lucas considered this, then nodded sagely. "Paperwork is important," he said. "My teacher says it keeps things fair." A small smile tugged at his mouth. "She's right." Lucas climbed back onto the couch, satisfied. He returned to his work, attaching files, double-checking timestamps, ensuring every document aligned cleanly. Accuracy wasn't just protection, it was leverage. When systems ran on records, records became power. An hour later, he sent the packet off. The confirmation ping felt quiet but significant. Another piece locked into place. He closed the laptop and leaned back, rolling his shoulders once to release the tension that had been accumulating all day. This phase required patience. Courts moved at their own pace, and pushing too hard now could backfire. He'd learned that long ago. Pressure applied at the wrong moment fractured more than it fixed. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Samuel. "Court moved faster than I expected. Means you hit a nerve." He typed back, "Facts tend to do that." A pause, then another message. "You handled it right. Didn't give them anything to dismiss." He read it once, then locked the phone. Validation wasn't necessary, but it was noted. Samuel understood the cost of restraint. Not everyone did, and the next morning arrived quietly. Breakfast followed routine. Same cereal, same mug, same reminder about the weather. He walked Lucas to the bus stop, watching until the doors folded shut and the bus pulled away. Only then did he allow himself to turn back toward the apartment. Inside, he checked his phone again. No new messages yet. That was fine. Silence meant the process was moving in the background, where it belonged. By midday, the court response came through. Acknowledgement of receipt. A note about timelines. A reminder that further clarification might be requested. Neutral language, but the underlying shift was unmistakable. They were working with him now, not around him. Later that afternoon, the phone rang while he was wiping down the counter. The sound cut through the apartment with a clarity that made his shoulders square instantly. He answered on the second ring, listening without speaking as the clerk explained the update. Her voice was professional, but there was something else beneath it now, respect, maybe, or caution. "Yes," he said when she finished. "I understand." He confirmed the time, the location, and ended the call. An expedited review, same courtroom, same judge. He closed his eyes briefly, then moved with purpose. This wasn't anxiety. It was readiness. He packed the folder again, checking each document out of habit rather than necessity. Accuracy was already locked in. What remained was presentation, and that wasn't his burden alone anymore. The courthouse felt different when he returned. Not quieter, not louder, just alert. Faces he recognized from before glanced up as he passed, some nodding faintly, others watching with open curiosity. The narrative had spread. Systems talked, even when they pretended not to. Inside the courtroom, the clerk greeted him with a nod and gestured to his seat. Samuel wasn't there this time. He didn't need to be. The truth had already arrived. Witnesses weren't required to keep it standing. When the judge entered, the room rose as one. She looked composed, but the ease was gone. This was controlled authority, not casual dominance. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and surveyed the room with measured focus. "Be seated," she said. She didn't waste time. "This court has completed its expedited review of the submitted materials," she began, voice steady, "including external oversight confirmations, medical documentation, and continuity plans." He listened, posture relaxed, hands folded loosely. The words mattered, but not as much as the tone. It wasn't dismissive anymore. It wasn't rushed. "The review confirms," she continued, "that the father has demonstrated sustained capacity, verified oversight, and consistent execution of parental responsibilities." She paused, letting the sentence land. "The court acknowledges that its initial assessment did not fully account for these factors." A murmur moved through the gallery. The admission was subtle, but unmistakable. Courts didn't often say that out loud. She went on, outlining the findings with clinical precision. Each point dismantled an earlier assumption. Instability countered by documentation. Limited means offset by planning. Perceived rigidity reframed as discipline. The file had spoken. Loudly. He felt something shift in his chest. Not relief exactly, but alignment. This was what process was supposed to feel like when it worked. The judge looked directly at him then. "The court finds no basis for temporary separation," she said. "Custody will remain unchanged." The words echoed, clean and final. Somewhere behind him, someone exhaled sharply. He didn't react outwardly. He'd learned long ago that victories didn't require movement. They required acknowledgement. She wasn't finished. "I also want to address something beyond the ruling," she said, tone tightening just slightly. The room stilled. "This court relies on efficient assessments. However, efficiency must never override thoroughness. In this case, assumptions were allowed to precede verification." Her gaze didn't waver. "That will be corrected." It wasn't an apology. It was something rarer in a courtroom, accountability. He inclined his head once, not in submission, but recognition. That was enough. The judge finalized the order, signed it, and passed it to the clerk. The gavel struck once. Court is adjourned. As the room broke into motion, the clerk approached him, offering the signed document. "You'll receive copies," she said quietly. "But this is official." "Thank you," he replied. The judge rose from the bench but paused before exiting. She looked at him one last time, expression unreadable, then nodded once. No smirk, no judgment, just acknowledgement. Outside, the steps felt solid beneath his feet. The air was crisp, the city loud in its indifference. He stood there for a moment, letting the sound wash over him, grounding himself in the ordinary. His phone buzzed. A message from the school confirming pickup time. He smiled faintly and started walking. When Lucas saw him at the gate, he ran, backpack bouncing, joy unfiltered. "You're early," the boy said. "Things wrapped up," he replied, kneeling to meet him. "How was your day?" "Good," Lucas said, then hesitated. "Are we okay?" He met his son's eyes. "We're okay." They walked home together, hands brushing occasionally, steps in sync. The world hadn't changed. Systems rarely did, but one system had been forced to look again, and that mattered. As they reached the building, he glanced back once toward the direction of the courthouse. The judge's smirk was gone now, replaced by something quieter and heavier. Respect. And this time, it had been earned on the record. The apartment door closed behind them with a familiar click, sealing out the noise of the city and letting routine reclaim its place. Lucas dropped his backpack by the wall and kicked off his shoes, already talking about dinner ideas, about a science project due next week, about a kid on the bus who asked too many questions. He listened, answering when needed, nodding when that was enough. Life resumed not with celebration, but with continuity. That felt right. He washed apples at the sink while Lucas set the table, counting plates out loud. The simple coordination grounded him more than any ruling ever could. This was the real measure of success, the ability to return to ordinary moments without fear shadowing them. Later, after homework and bedtime stories, Lucas finally drifted off, breathing slow and even. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than usual, watching the rise and fall of his son's chest, letting the quiet settle fully. The court order sat on the kitchen counter folded neatly, already losing its immediacy in the face of something far more permanent. He moved through the apartment, turning off lights, locking the door, setting the alarm. Each action was deliberate, unhurried. There was no rush anymore. The threat had passed, not because the system had suddenly become kind, but because it had been forced to be accurate. He sat at the small table with a cup of coffee, steam curling upward, and allowed himself a moment of reflection. Not anger at the judge, not satisfaction at being proven right. Just clarity. The smirk hadn't been personal. It rarely was. It had been institutional, born from pattern recognition that confused familiarity with truth. He'd seen it before in other forms, other rooms. Systems trusted shortcuts. People paid the price. What changed wasn't the system's nature. It was its awareness. Awareness that someone standing quietly at the margins might understand it better than those seated at the center. The judge would move on to the next case, the next file, the next set of assumptions. But something had shifted. A pause had been introduced where none existed before. A hesitation. A reminder that dignity didn't always announce itself loudly. He finished his coffee and rinsed the mug, placing it upside down on the rack. Tomorrow would bring work, school drop-offs, emails, maintenance requests. Life didn't rearrange itself just because justice briefly aligned. And he didn't want it to. As he prepared for bed, his phone buzzed once more. A final notification from the court system confirming the order had been filed. He read it, then archived it without ceremony. The record existed. That was enough. He lay down, staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle around him. Somewhere above, water ran through pipes. somewhere below a television murmured. Ordinary sounds, safe sounds. Before sleep claimed him, one thought surfaced, clear and steady. Power wasn't loud. It didn't need a bench or a robe or a raised voice. Real power was the ability to stand still while being misjudged, knowing the truth would eventually demand space. The judge had smirked because she thought she understood the story. A veteran had stood because he knew when silence stopped serving justice. And a single father had held his ground, not to win, but to protect. That was what this had always been about. Not humiliation, not reversal, not even vindication. It was about a system learning, in front of witnesses, that dignity doesn't come from position. It comes from responsibility, carried consistently, whether anyone is watching or not. And that lesson, once seen, doesn't fade easily. If you want the next story, ask me for the title you want to hear next. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. A rich woman tried to shame a single dad in first class. The pilot heard everything. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?